Hey guys, so quick note before we jump into the video here. I wrote this video back in June and recorded it back in June, but never got around to actually editing the video. So that's why some stuff might be a little bit like outdated in what I say. Um, that's about all. But yeah, I'm editing it now, releasing it. Um, I'm working on another video. I wrote a video a couple of weeks ago and I want to record it and edit it, get it done, get it out sometime before Thanksgiving. No promises, but that's my goal. And then I have a couple other ideas for videos that I want to get out before 2021. But yeah, that's about it. So last week, The Last of Us 2 was released worldwide to universal praise from critics and a more mixed response from fans. Now, admittedly, I've not actually played The Last of Us 2. I haven't even played the first Last of Us. I have, however, watched playthroughs of these games, and so have at the very least experienced their stories in some capacity. Now, as someone who studies film and filmmaking, it always interests me when games have complex narratives that look to compete with narratives found in movies. And in my opinion, Last of Us and Last of Us 2 are prime examples of video games with narratives that look to bridge the gap between the two mediums in terms of storytelling. So, without further ado, today I want to talk about how The Last of Us 2 is a conventional narrative told unconventionally. Now, a lot of the criticisms by fans of The Last of Us 2 regards the writing of the game, and how it is quote-unquote bad. As someone who has not played the game and only watched it, the writing is one of the things I actually can talk about. Now, I won't get into the writing as it isn't the focus of this video, but I will say that I don't think it's bad. The Last of Us 2 isn't perfectly written, but for a video game, I would say it is better than average. However, I don't think it's the writing of The Last of Us that elevates the story to something that is truly special. As, like I said, the story is pretty conventional. Rather, the structure of the story is what makes The Last of Us 2 stand out. Now, before I continue, I would like to mention that everything past this part of the video will contain major spoilers for The Last of Us Part 2. So if you plan on playing the game, or even watching it on YouTube or Twitch like me, I'd advise you go and do that, and then come back to this video later. So with that out of the way, let's talk about how The Last of Us Part 2 is structured. Now, The Last of Us Part 2 actually does follow a traditional 3-act structure in my opinion, with the first act starting at the beginning of the game and ending with Joel's death. The second act beginning with Ellie's choice to pursue Joel's killer, Abby, and ending with Abby and Ellie crossing paths and then going their separate ways. Finally, the third act begins with Ellie going after Abby once again, and it ends with her sparing Abby and going back to the farmhouse. In this way, The Last of Us 2 does follow a traditional 3-act structure found in traditional movies. But where The Last of Us 2 is different from a lot of movies is the differing substructures of each of its acts. The first act starts with Joel and Tommy immediately after the events of Last of Us. We even see Joel and Ellie in a nice scene where Joel gives Ellie his guitar. After this, we get a time jump, and for the next couple hours, we switch between two perspectives interchangeably, Abby and Ellie. Ellie is scouting with her girlfriend Dina, and Abby is searching for a man who we later find out is Joel. This all culminates with Abby luring Joel into her trap, and Ellie finding Abby, killing Joel. This first act, as I'll call it, is actually pretty conventional storytelling. It uses a technique which is known as Meanwhile Back at the Ranch, which just means that the game cuts between two stories interchangeably. This technique allows us to get to know our two main characters, Ellie and Abby, equally, before we get into Act 2. However, in Act 2, The Last of Us Part 2 completely drops its Meanwhile Back at the Ranch approach to storytelling, instead opting to tell the story of one main character completely in Act 2, and then tell the story of the other main character completely in Act 2. In my opinion, I think this is a very interesting way to tell what will otherwise be a pretty conventional predator and prey revenge story, with Ellie being the predator hunting down Abby for revenge, and Abby being the prey who is hunted by Ellie. The structuring of this second act leaves the story more open-ended than a conventional Meanwhile Back at the Ranch structure would. Unlike a meanwhile back at the ranch structure method of storytelling, which would only enforce the idea of there being a clear-cut protagonist and antagonist, this second act forces the audience to play as Ellie and Abby independently and empathize and hear their stories separately without the distraction of constantly switching perspectives. After playing as both Ellie and Abby independently in the second act, instead of interchangeably like in the first act, the third act moves into a meanwhile back at the ranch style once again, with the second act having set up our feelings of each character in the most fair and unbiased way, in order for us to view the climax in a more neutral view. All flashbacks placed in key moments are an attempt to make us not only empathize with Ellie, but Abby as well. Whether this works for you is completely up to how much of an open mind you have. I will say as a passive viewer of The Last of Us Part 2 that the plot structure completely worked on me. So with all this being said, is The Last of Us 2 a good game, or even a masterpiece because of this? I can't really say. I haven't actually played the game after all, but I will say that in my opinion, the story of The Last of Us Part 2 is meticulously crafted with lots of purpose and attention to detail, which makes it work in my eyes at least. The story may not be as airtight as the first Last of Us, as some parts definitely seem to drone on, and there are some weaker characters and plot threads, but it definitely is a much more experimental and interesting story in my opinion. I hope to see more games experiment with story structure like this in the future. Anyway, that's all for now. I just wanted to make this video essay as a way to provide a perspective on The Last of Us 2 from a purely story structure viewpoint. So, that's been the video.